The first warning appeared at 9:07 on a bright Tuesday morning, when the stock market was still glowing green across the walls of the executive boardroom. By 9:42, the green had disappeared. By 10:15, panic had swallowed the entire building. And before noon, nearly $900 million had vanished from the value of a company that had once been considered untouchable. At the center of it all sat Mara Veylan, the CEO who had ignored one man's advice because she believed confidence was more valuable than caution. Across the glass table, that same man watched the numbers collapse without celebrating, without smiling, and without saying, "I told you so." His name was Ronan Vale, and what Mara discovered about him that morning would change the way she understood success, failure, and the quiet power of a second chance. Before we go deeper into this emotional story, if you believe kindness matters, people deserve second chances, and one good decision can change a person's entire life, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to Beyond Single Dad. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to people who need a reminder that failure is not always the end. Mara had built Veylan Horizon from almost nothing. 15 years earlier, she had been a young financial analyst working from a cramped apartment with a second-hand laptop and a stack of unpaid bills. She had learned the language of markets before she learned how to sleep properly, and she had turned every rejection into another reason to keep moving. By the time she became CEO, Veylan Horizon was worth billions, employed thousands of people, and had become one of the most respected investment technology firms in the country. Newspapers called Mara brilliant. Investors called her fearless. Employees called her demanding but fair. She secretly called herself tired. Every morning, she arrived before sunrise, and every evening she left after most of the office lights had gone dark. She had spent years convincing herself that exhaustion was simply the price of being successful. Ronan Vale entered her world differently. He was not a famous investor, not a television personality, and not someone who arrived surrounded by assistants. He was a quiet risk strategist with an unusual ability to recognize weaknesses other people overlooked. He had spent 20 years studying market behavior, corporate debt, and the strange human emotions that moved money faster than mathematics ever could. When he joined Veylan Horizon as an external advisor, several executives questioned why Mara had hired someone so understated. Ronan rarely raised his voice. He never tried to impress anyone. He simply studied numbers until the numbers told him something was wrong. 3 weeks before the disaster, Ronan noticed a pattern in one of Veylan Horizon's largest investment portfolios. A group of technology assets had been rising at a speed that looked impressive on paper, but underneath the growth was a dangerous combination of borrowed money, artificial demand, and increasingly fragile partnerships. Ronan spent 2 nights reviewing the data. Then he prepared a detailed report recommending that the company reduce its exposure immediately. He warned that if the market turned even slightly, the losses could become catastrophic. Mara read the report at the end of a 12-hour day. She understood the calculations, but she did not accept the conclusion. The company had already committed enormous resources to the strategy, and abandoning it would make Veylan Horizon look uncertain. Worse, one of the firm's biggest shareholders had publicly praised Mara for making aggressive decisions. She feared that changing direction now would be interpreted as weakness. Ronan tried to explain that changing course was not weakness when the road ahead had become dangerous, but Mara had already made up her mind. She rejected his recommendation and instructed her team to maintain the position. Ronan did not argue. He simply nodded and returned to his office. That should have been the end of it. Instead, the next morning, Ronan quietly sent Mara a second message explaining that he was concerned not only about the investment itself but about how quickly the company was becoming emotionally attached to its own success. He reminded her that markets did not care about reputations, titles, or past victories. Mara took the message personally. She believed Ronan was questioning her leadership. In a private meeting, she told him that she appreciated his expertise but that she had spent 15 years building the company and knew when to trust her instincts. Ronan looked at her for a long moment and calmly told her that instincts were valuable, but sometimes the hardest thing for a leader was knowing when fear was disguising itself as confidence. Mara ended the meeting and walked away convinced she had proven her authority. Then came Tuesday. At 9:07 a.m., the first major partner announced unexpected losses. At 9:12, another company suspended trading. At 9:19, analysts began revising their forecasts. By 9:30, investors were selling everything connected to the technology sector. Veylan Horizon's trading screens turned red so quickly that several employees initially thought the system had malfunctioned. It had not. The market was collapsing exactly where Ronan had warned it could. Mara stood in the center of the executive room, staring at the numbers. Her chief financial officer, Elian Sorrell, told her the company had already lost hundreds of millions in market value. She ordered the team to stabilize the portfolio, but every attempt to sell pushed prices lower. By 10:15, the estimated loss had crossed $600 million. By 10:48, it was approaching $900 million. Employees gathered silently in hallways. Phones rang without stopping. Investors demanded explanations. News cameras appeared outside the building. Mara's name began appearing on financial websites alongside words like collapse, miscalculation, and leadership failure. For the first time in 15 years, Mara had no answer. She walked into Ronan's office expecting anger. Instead, she found him studying a set of printed charts. He looked up and saw the fear in her face. She did not ask him to save the company. She did not defend herself. She simply admitted that he had been right. Ronan stood and told her there was no time for pride. The company still had valuable assets, thousands of employees, and enough liquidity to survive if they acted quickly. He had spent the previous night preparing an emergency plan because he suspected the situation could deteriorate. His plan involved selling selected assets, freezing several risky investments, renegotiating short-term obligations, and approaching a group of long-term institutional investors who might provide temporary capital in exchange for stricter oversight. Mara asked why he had prepared all of that after she had rejected his advice. Ronan answered that protecting the company had never been about proving himself right. It was about making sure people who depended on the company did not pay the price for one bad decision. Those words broke something inside Mara. She had spent years believing leadership meant carrying everything alone. Ronan showed her that leadership could also mean admitting when you were wrong and trusting someone else enough to help you recover. For the next 6 hours, the two worked side by side. There was no ego in the room anymore. Mara called investors personally. Ronan coordinated the emergency strategy. Elian worked through the company's cash position. Teams across the building moved with exhausted determination. Nobody knew whether the company would survive, but for the first time that day, they were fighting the same battle. By sunset, Veylan Horizon had lost nearly $900 million in value, but it had avoided the complete collapse everyone feared. The company was wounded badly, yet it was alive. The following weeks were brutal. Mara faced angry shareholders, hostile journalists, and a board that demanded accountability. She could have blamed market conditions. She could have blamed her advisors. She could have claimed that no one could have predicted the collapse. Instead, she stood before the board and accepted responsibility. She admitted that Ronan had warned her, that she had rejected his advice, and that her pride had influenced her decision. It was perhaps the most difficult speech she had ever given. Something unexpected happened afterward. Employees began sending messages of support. Some investors who had criticized her admitted that her honesty had restored their confidence. And Ronan remained beside her, not because he needed a promotion or recognition, but because he believed the company could still become something stronger than it had been before. Months passed. Veylan Horizon rebuilt slowly. Mara changed the company's culture from one that celebrated fearless risk-taking to one that rewarded thoughtful disagreement. Executives were encouraged to challenge her decisions. Analysts were given permission to raise uncomfortable questions. Ronan became the head of a new risk division, but Mara insisted that his greatest contribution should never be measured by his title. One afternoon, almost a year after the collapse, Mara and Ronan stood beside the same boardroom windows where the disaster had begun. The city outside was bright beneath the afternoon sun. Traffic moved through the streets, people hurried between buildings, and the world looked completely ordinary. Mara looked at Ronan and told him that losing $900 million had been the most expensive lesson of her life, but it had also been the lesson that saved her from becoming the kind of leader who could never admit she was wrong. Ronan smiled and told her that sometimes the biggest losses reveal what money was hiding. Mara looked down at the city and realized something she had never understood when she was younger. Success had taught her how to win, but failure had taught her how to become human. She had believed the company needed a fearless CEO. What it really needed was a leader who could listen, apologize, learn, and give other people permission to be honest. The story never became a story about a woman who lost $900 million. It became a story about what she did after losing it. Years later, Veylan Horizon would recover its value and eventually surpass its previous peak. But Mara never celebrated that achievement as loudly as she celebrated something much smaller. Every year, on the anniversary of the collapse, she gathered the employees who had stayed during the crisis and thanked them personally. She would remind them that companies were not buildings, stock prices, or billions written on screens. Companies were people. People with families, hopes, mortgages, dreams, and lives depending on the decisions made in rooms they would never enter. And Ronan's warning remained framed on Mara's office wall, not because she wanted to remember the mistake, but because she wanted to remember the lesson. Being wrong is painful, but refusing to listen can be far more expensive. If this story touched your heart, please don't just watch silently. Like the video, share it with someone who may be struggling with failure, and subscribe to Beyond Single Dad. Sometimes a simple share can help a person discover the courage to begin again. And before the story ends, I have one special request. Comment "second chances" below if you believe that making a mistake should never mean losing the chance to become a better person. Because sometimes life does not give us a second chance by preventing the fall. Sometimes it gives us a second chance by putting someone beside us when we finally hit the ground. Mara lost nearly $900 million in one morning, but she gained something money could never buy: the humility to listen, the courage to admit the truth, and the wisdom to understand that the greatest leaders are not those who are never wrong. They are the ones who, after being wrong, choose to make things right.